And urban people like Jews and Catholics felt they were being imposed upon by rural principles and values that didn't coincide with their vision of America as a non-sectarian, open, free, uninhibited state. So the Jews resisted it, as did obviously the Irish Catholics. There were exceptions to prohibition. Liquor could be distributed for spiritual purposes in synagogues, in churches, and in Jewish homes. So you had a tenfold expansion of synagogue membership. And you literally had non-Jewish organized groups under the leadership of Rabbi Sean O'Brien or Rabbi Charlie Chan. It was a very odd kind of development. Now, here's what's really interesting, and I didn't know a lot of this until I recently read a book that's been published just very recently, a book called Jews and Booze. It's written by a woman named Rachel Rubin, who's an assistant professor, I believe, at the University of Rochester. She points out, I said last time, and I have to correct myself because I hadn't read the book at that time. I said 25% of bootleggers during Prohibition were Jewish. She says 50%. 50%. 25% were Italian and 10% were Irish. But more than that, again, I didn't know this, and I tentatively shared it with you last time. Jews have been very involved in the entire liquor industry for over 1,000 years, as distillers, as distributors. And she points out, and she's done scrupulous research, something like 35 to 40% of all Polish taverns were managed by Jews. Something like 40% of all Jews in... Pardon? Oh. Are you talking to me? Something like 40% of all Polish Jews were making their living in the liquor industry. So it was something I hadn't realized. And what's really important to understand is that the entree of Jews into bootlegging, and by the way, the word bootlegger, anybody know the meaning of the word? Hiding liquor inside the boot of your pants leg. Jews were moving, as I tried to explain last time, by the advent of World War I, Jews were moving out of organized crime. There are very few Jews at the age of 25 or 6 or 27 who were still involved in organized crime. They were becoming respectable. Prohibition was so lucrative and so inviting that it drew significant Jews back into the world of organized crime. So you have key bootleggers, Arnold Rothstein, we'll talk about in a moment, Bugsy Siegel, Lansky, Longy Zwillman from Control, Newark, New Jersey, Waxy Gordon. And what's important to understand is that Jews entering into the world of bootlegging had to compete against the Italians, against the Irish, who had their own indigenous constituencies for the consumption of hard liquor. The Jews did not. Jews drank wine in synagogues, they drank wine at home, they drank maybe a lot at Purim, but they weren't heavy drinkers, which means that if you were a Jew entering into the illegal trade of bootlegging, you had to be tougher and more ruthless and more determined than your ethnic counterparts. All of this, as I tried to explain last time, is a contradiction to the image of the Jew as the yeshiva bocher and the Shabbat celebrant and high holiday celebrant and the intellectual. Again, I want to point out, I don't have all the answers to some of the questions I posed last time, and some of you may have something to offer that would enlighten me as well. Let's move to a close look at Arnold Rothstein, who is the key transitional figure from the world of disorderly gang warfare on the streets of the Lower East Side. Arnold Rothstein is a man who literally transformed organized crime from a thuggish, hoodlum-oriented activity to, in effect, a corporate structure with him as the top CEO. He was an amazing figure, very controversial even today. The king of the bookmakers, the king of the drug trade, the so-called alleged fixer of the 1919 World Series between the Chicago White Sox and the Cincinnati Reds. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. He claims that he wasn't involved, although he made about $250,000 on a bet. And it's very unlikely that he wouldn't have been somehow involved, but he was never convicted. Beat every rap that came his way. We're all familiar with F. Scott Fitzgerald's portrait of Arnold Rothstein in The Great Gatsby, the portrait of Meyer Wolfsheim. If you haven't read The Great Gatsby, please read it before it's too late. The portrait is interesting. It fits in with the general mood of literary anti-Semitism that was very common at that time in the 1920s, 30s. Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Edith Wharton, E.E. Cummings, and the whole world of famous American writers who indulged in what was at that time sort of almost an accepted notion of Jews as being vulgar and crass and materialistic and sort of obnoxious. And we have that in the portrait of Meyer Wolfsheim. Rothstein was not born on the Lower East Side. Rothstein was born on the Upper West Side, the son of highly successful German Jewish immigrants. Remember, the German Jews came around 1848 with the collapse of the revolutions in Europe and a lot of turbulence in Germany. They settled on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and they became, in effect, ultimately the top bankers, the top business people, the top professionals. You have the Adlers and the Oakses who owned the New York Times, and you have the Schiffs. Jacob Schiff almost single-handedly financed the Japanese war against Russia in 1905 because he hated the Tsar's anti-Semitism. The Sulzbergers, the Guggenheims, the Fleischmans, and so forth. So you have this disparity in Jewish cultural history between Upper West Side successful German Jews and the massive inpouring of our grandparents. I assume most of you are coming from where I came from, and that's my grandparents coming from Poland, from Galicia, Austria-Hungarian Empire, and from Ukraine. Settling in the Lower East Side. If you had a little money after a certain number of years, you moved up to Harlem. And after a while, you moved to the Bronx. If you really made it, you moved somewhere to Riverdale or Westchester, or across the George Washington Bridge, where I lived in Teaneck, New Jersey. You have a similar division in the Irish community. Those of you who are Irish, you've heard of the Shanty Irish and lace curtain Irish. The Italians severely divided between Southern Italians and Northern Italians. Arnold Rothstein, born into this very privileged, highly successful family on the Upper West Side. His father was known as Abe the Just, very successful businessman, often called in as a mediator in communal disputes. His father tried to teach him all the right things, but Rothstein was not interested in what his father had to teach, particularly when it came to gambling. Gambling was taboo to his father, but Rothstein was a mathematical genius. He was like a computer. He didn't need a computer. His mind was like a computer. He had a mastery of numbers and mathematics that was absolutely mind-boggling and astonishing. And he loved gambling, whether it was dice or whether it was pool, any kind of gambling. And he tried to describe what it meant to him later in his life in an interview. I always gambled. I can't remember when I didn't. Maybe I gambled to show my father that he couldn't tell me what to do, but I don't think so. I think I gambled because I loved the excitement. When I gambled, nothing else mattered. I could play for hours and not know how much time had passed. And he would play for incredibly high stakes. I'm talking $100,000, $200,000, $300,000. This is in 1920s, right? He was very athletic, quick, highly intelligent, extremely well dressed, athletic, was the mentor to Lucky Luciano. We'll talk about him a little later, who became ultimately the top kingpin of organized crime in America. Luciano said, Arnold Rothstein taught me everything I needed to know about how to dress, how to act, how to speak, how to deal with people at high-level business transactions. Rothstein didn't drink except milk, didn't smoke, didn't chew gum, didn't chew tobacco. He was involved in so many things, whether it was bootlegging or whether it was union busting or whether it was loan sharking or was theft or whatever the criminal activity he was involved with, so many activities and with so many people that it's very difficult to understand what story about him may be true and what may be false. I mean, no matter how many biographies are written, it's hard to really understand what is true and what is not. Brought up on many charges, never convicted because he was connected to everybody in society, whether it was the political world, whether it was the legal world, whether it was the business world, whether it was the world of Broadway or show business. One of his closest friends was Damon Runyon, whose writings led to the creation of one of Broadway's great musicals, Guys and Dolls. The character of Nathan Detroit was closely modeled on Arnold Rothstein and the whole idea of the floating crap game. He was linked to the world of mobsters, the professional elite, opened his first casino on West 46th Street with protection money paid to the Tammany Hall, which I tried to explain last time was a corrupt but highly powerful political body that really ran New York City. By the time he was 30, he was a multimillionaire. His casino was so successful, brought in incredible amounts of money. And when reformers tried to close down the casinos, he came up with the idea of the floating crap game. I'm sure you're all familiar with Guys and Dolls. Again, as far as the fixing of the World Series, impossible to think that he wasn't involved, but nothing was ever proven, and he denied it to the end of his life. The key to understanding Rothstein's role in the whole subject that I'm trying to present is prohibition. Rothstein was very smart. He knew that when prohibition would be enacted, it would create incredible lucrative opportunities. He traveled to Scotland, he traveled to England, he traveled to Canada. He schmoozed with the Bronfman family that owned Seagram's Liquor, very high-level distilled liquor. By the way, I never knew this, but the name Bronfman in Yiddish means liquor man. Yeah, liquor man. He goes to these countries, he talks with the distillers, he buys up tons of liquor, still in the barrels. The problem was not getting the liquor out of the country onto ships because the ships could go to a 3-mile limit in Long Island and New Jersey. The liquor then had to be brought off the ships onto speedboats faster than the maritime cops. And the speedboats had to get the liquor to the shore where a whole fleet of trucks would be waiting to have it packed onto the trucks and then driven to the casinos and the restaurants and the saloons. The trouble was the trucks could be hijacked any step of the way because that was the norm in criminal activity. So you had to have the toughest men riding shotgun on these. The two toughest guys were Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. Rothstein knew he couldn't handle this alone. He needed partners. So he goes to an 18-year-old kid named Meyer Lansky, who even at the age of 18 was known to be a kind of business organizational genius. He invites Lansky to a dinner meeting at the Park Central Hotel, Rothstein's hangout. For 6 hours, he regales this 18-year-old kid, flatters him, says, I need you as a partner to conduct this whole operation. By the way, every operation that I just described cost about $175,000. Rothstein said, I'm willing to bankroll it if I know it's going to work. I need you. Lansky says, I'm in. And I'm going to bring into the picture my buddy Siegel, Bugsy Siegel. I'm going to bring in Luciano, Charlie Luciano. And that's what Rothstein really wanted, because everybody knew that Luciano was one of the few Italian gangsters at that time that was willing to operate with non-Italians, particularly with the Jews. All this became...
I'm sorry. Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, they were from the Lower East Side.
Right, yeah.
And so there was a gap that was bridged there.
Right, between
the Upper West Side and the Lower East
Well,
Side.
no, not really, because the Italians lived side by side with the Jews. And again, I try to bring this forth last time. Why the bond between the Jews and the Italians, and the antipathy between the Jews and the Irish? It's a whole subject that I think has not been fully yet explored. But geographically, we're talking about 540,000 Jews living in a 2 square mile called the Lower East Side, and you have the Italians and the Irish living very close by. Gang wars, street fights, intra-ethnic violence. I told you before, last time, Eddie Cantor was in the hospital for 3 months with a brain concussion, beaten up by Jews from Division Street, whereas he lived on Henry Street. So this gets a little complicated, but there was a link. The key linkage is Lansky, Siegel, Luciano, and everybody who Luciano brought in his wake. Rothstein's end comes when he was 46 years old. On November 3rd, 1928, gets into a very high stakes card game at the Park Central Hotel. Card game run by a man named McManus, Hunk McManus. Rothstein loses $300,000. 1928. Claims the game was rigged. Refuses to pay the bet. Very dangerous to welch on a bet. He leaves in a huff. Rothstein's hangout was Lindy's, the famous restaurant on 49th Street and Broadway, and he would conduct business on the street corner, surrounded by bodyguards, doing all kinds of deals, paying off people, arranging all kinds of deals. He gets summoned to the Park Central Hotel, goes into the hotel alone and unarmed, walks into room 342 and gets shot in the gut with a .38 revolver. Staggers out of the hotel onto the street, somehow calls an ambulance. The cops questioned him. Who did this to you, Arnold? I'm not telling. You do your job, I'll do mine. So Rothstein's end, the big brain, the big Jew uptown, the kingmaker, AR to his closest friends, dies November 3rd, 1928.
How old was he?
He was about 46 years old. 90 years after his death, still unknown who killed him. All kinds of theories that we don't have time to go into right now. Lansky had an interesting statement about his beloved friend and mentor, Arnold Rothstein. The gambling fever that was always part of Arnie's makeup appeared to have gone to his brain. It was like a disease and was now in its last stage. He gambled wildly, and wild gamblers never win. Following Rothstein's death, we come to one of the key moments in the history of organized crime. Let me try to explain it to you as best I can. Very important for you to understand this. It's called the Castellammarese War. Anybody hear of this? The Castellammarese War. Ostensibly, it was a war between two rival Sicilian mobsters. The Masseria family, led by Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masseria, and the Maranzano family, led by Salvatore Maranzano, a fairly new immigrant from Sicily into the United States. But what the war was really about was a clash between two Italian generations. between Italians born in Sicily and Italians born essentially in Naples and the Camorra region of southern Italy. This clash is crucially important to understand the evolution of organized crime in America, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry. It starts really with Mussolini. Remember, Mussolini gained power in Italy in 1922. He lasts until his death in 1945. Mussolini declares war on the mafia, imprisons thousands of mafiosi, kills I don't know how many more. A very important Sicilian don named Don Ferra decides to muscle into the mafia organization in America. He sends his trusted henchman, Salvatore Maranzano, to New York to muscle in and gain control. And we have the outbreak of a furious gang warfare between two Sicilian mobsters and their families. By the way, family doesn't mean brothers and sisters by blood and flesh. It means, your organization. The Young Turks, even those born in Sicily like Luciano, but Americanized, coming to America at a fairly early age, were totally at odds with the mustache Petes, as they were called, the Sicilians of tradition, of ritual, of prejudice, of skepticism, of distrust of anybody who didn't come from their village in Sicily. But you have Luciano and Frank Costello and Anastasia and Adonis and these others who saw organized crime not in terms of tradition and ritual, but in terms of business. And anything that interferes in business has to be overcome. This was the basic background. And these men, these Italians, were more than willing to work with other ethnic communities, particularly the Jews. Gang warfare breaks out, gun battles in the street, innocent bystanders getting killed and wounded. Luciano sees this as utterly destructive. Luciano was Masseria's chief lieutenant. And interesting, it's so crazy to try to reveal all this. In 1929, just before the war really breaks out, Luciano, as Masseria's chief lieutenant, is abducted by three men in a limousine, taken into the car, savagely beaten, stabbed, tortured, and left for dead on a beach in Staten Island. Miraculously, Luciano recovers, therefore the name Lucky Luciano. It was Maranzano's men that did this to him, but in 1930, when the war breaks out, Luciano decides that the war is moving in the favor of Maranzano and decides to betray Masseria and side with Maranzano. He meets with Maranzano and says, I will have Masseria dead, but I want to be the key man in your new organization. Maranzano agrees. Luciano sets up Masseria's death, which takes place in Coney Island at a restaurant called the Via Nuova Tamano. So you have Masseria sitting alone with Luciano, having dinner and playing cards. Luciano drinks 5 espressos, excuses himself to go to the men's room. In comes a hit squad made up of 4 men, 3 Italians and 1 Jew. The Italians are Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joey Adonis, and the 1 Jew is Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. They come up behind Masseria, one of the most powerful mafia bosses in history. They take out their guns and they fire 8 bullets through the back of his head, into his neck, in his back, through his chest, falls to the floor in a pool of blood. Later, a photographer photographing the scene takes the ace of spades, puts it in the hand, the outstretched hand. Great photo, classic photo. Maranzano is now triumphant. Luciano is his key aide. Calls a meeting of the mafia chieftains in Wappingers Falls, New York, a resort area. and declares a new era for the mafia. The new era would consist of chieftains from 30 families in 30 cities of America and 5 families in New York. Maranzano declared that he was now capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses. Unfortunate decision on his part led partially to the cause of his death. The 5 families in New York at that moment, one was headed by Luciano, and that is now the Genovese family. Another would be led by Joe Profaci, and that is now the Colombo family. A third family would be headed by Tommy Gagliano, and that would be the Lucchese family. A fourth by Maranzano himself, and that is now the Bonanno family. And the fifth by Frank Scalise, that is now the Gambino family. Those are the 5 families that are still in existence, still operative. Each family would be structured in the following way. You'd have the Don, the boss. And like the Pope, his word was sacred. He was given enormous power. He would be assisted by the underboss, the deputy boss. There would be the consigliere, very trusted, very savvy, very sophisticated operative, usually a lawyer. And he would be the liaison to the world of law enforcement, the world of judges, the world of business leaders, the world of civic leaders, the world of politicians. Then you'd have below that the capo regime. Capo regime would be in charge of soldiers. Each crew would have 10 to 20 soldiers. Each soldier would have control over a particular operation. Those of you who watched The Sopranos for years know exactly how this worked. You had to be a blood member Italian in order to be part of the mafia. They diminished that somewhat by saying you had to be a full Italian through your father. And below all this would be the area they call the associates. And the associates could be made up of people who were not Italian, key members of the Jewish underground mob scene. This was Maranzano's vision, and Luciano was not happy. Luciano began to look at Maranzano as not as progressive as he had hoped, probably as greedy, as selfish, and as hidebound traditional as Masseria. Decides to kill him and take power. He asks Meyer Lansky to form a hit squad made up all of Jews. Because to get to Maranzano in his inner office, you couldn't have Italians, they would be too recognized. So the hit squad was made up of 6 men. The leader was a killer named Samuel Red Levine, whose stated policy was not to kill on Shabbat. Then you had Abraham Bo Weinberg, who became chief lieutenant to Dutch Schultz, Albert Tick-Tock Tannenbaum, and 3 others whose names are a bit obscure at this point. The hit squad comes to 230 Park Avenue in Manhattan. They ascend 9 flights to an office called the Eagle Building Corporation, which was Maranzano's headquarters. They enter into the waiting room and they flash badges indicating that they are Treasury agents on a raid looking into illicit business activities. Bodyguards are held up against the wall, their hands against the wall, and they're guarded by 2 of the 6 men with guns. 4 of them enter into Maranzano's inner office, and a ferocious fight breaks out. Maranzano ferociously resists his assassins, but they cut his throat, they stab him repeatedly, and they shoot him dead. That's the end of Maranzano. It's the end of the.
Squad Murder Incorporated?
No, this comes later. This comes next time we meet. Maranzano was dead. The Castellamarese War is over. By the way, the Castellamarese, the name of the Sicilian town where Maranzano was born, Castellamarese del Golfo. That's where the name comes from. The way is totally cleared now for Lucky Luciano to assume total control. He doesn't take the name Capo di Tutti Capi, but he assumes in effect full power. And he forms what he calls the commission. The commission is made up of the heads of key families and key Jewish associates, particularly Siegel, Lansky, Buchholter, Jacob Gure Shapiro. The commission is the Supreme Court of organized crime. The decision has to be consensual, unanimous. Any disobedience against the decision of the commission is death. Let me conclude this discussion today with the most famous and notorious example of what happens when you defy the will of the commission. And that, of course, is the example of Dutch Schultz. By the way, let me just point out that after the death of Maranzano, and this is highly conjectural, according to gangland folklore, what followed was what they call the Night of the Sicilian Vespers, which was the national massacre of the old Sicilian mustache Petes. Now, this gets a little tricky because gangland historians claim this didn't really happen, but Joe Vallacchi, remember Joe Vallacchi testifying before Congress, the first mafia member to betray the code of omertà, says it did happen, that this massacre was conducted under the tutelage, under the leadership of Luciano. The whole former Sicilian mustache Pete generation wiped out. If you recall Godfather 1, it ends with the Night of the Sicilian Vespers. Let's turn finally to Dutch Schultz. He was born Arthur Simon Flegenheimer, the son of German Jewish parents in the Bronx, born in the Bronx. At a very early age, even in his teens, Dutch Schultz was known and feared as an absolutely brutal, merciless, sadistic killer. And he was hired as a hitman by the chief mobsters at the time. Dutch Schultz, and you've seen him portrayed in dozens of Hollywood films. Dutch Schultz terrified other mobsters. I can't even share with you some of the things he did because it's simply too upsetting. He was feared. And he made his gangland success first in bootlegging and then in the numbers racket. And he muscled his way into the incredibly lucrative numbers racket in Brooklyn and in New Jersey and in Manhattan. It's unbelievable, but in the 1930s, his gang was bringing in $20 million a year from the numbers racket. Numbers racket is when you buy 5 cents or 10 cents and you hope to get $60, you know, if you come, multi-million. And he controlled it through sheer terror and brute force. He then went on to extort restaurant owners and union workers, extracting dues and extortion fees. It is estimated that when Dutch Schultz died, he hid a fortune that today would be worth about $160 million. It has never been found. Apparently he buried it somewhere in the Catskills. Nobody has ever been able to find it. What happens? Out of this whole morass rises a singular individual, an absolutely incorruptible, brilliant, utterly determined attorney, U.S. attorney, later special prosecutor, named Thomas E. Dewey. Dewey scared the hell out of organized crime. He was beyond any kind of corruption. And he chose to get at them in a very effective way, and that was tax evasion. Couldn't get them on murder or outright theft or brutality because no witness would dare come forth and testify against him. But tax evasion was a different story. He starts cracking down on organized crime, and he names Dutch Schultz as his designated enemy number one. Dutch Schultz is brought forth in 2 trials on tax evasion, gets acquitted in both trials, but knows that Dewey will not rest until he brings him down. Schultz goes to the commission. I want Dewey killed. The commission unanimously says, no, if we kill somebody that level, we will bring down the entire barrage of law enforcement on organized crime. Schultz gets enraged, storms out of the meeting, telling them, I'll do it myself. I don't, screw you. The commission meets and deliberates for 6 hours and obviously comes up with a decision to eliminate the Dutchman. Lefke Buchholter is asked to choose 2 Jewish gunmen to do the job. Buchholter chooses 2 very competent, seasoned gunmen. One was Emanuel Mendy Weiss, and the other was Charles the Bug Workman. October 13th, 1935, Newark, New Jersey, 12 East Park Avenue, Newark Chop House, restaurant, 10:15 p.m. Closed, still some help cleaning up the place. A getaway car deposits the 2 gunmen in front of the restaurant. Mendy Weiss and Bug Workman come out, enter the restaurant. Weiss is carrying a sawed-off shotgun. Workman has a .38 caliber and a .45 caliber. I've seen a picture of the Newark Chop House. Try to imagine, you walk in, it's a long corridor, and there's a counter on the right-hand side, a long counter, and on the left-hand side, against the wall, are tables. And at the very, very end of the long counter is the bathroom, men's room. Try to imagine this. The 2 gunmen come in. They tell the help to get on the floor and keep their mouths shut. There's a table right in the middle of the corridor. 3 men are sitting there. One is Otto Abadaba Berman, and he is the chief accountant for Dutch Schultz. The other is Abraham Abe Landau, who is his chief lieutenant. And the third is a hulking giant of a guy named Bernard Lulu Rosenkrantz, and he's the chief bodyguard. The 2 gunmen come up to the table with the 3 men and they open fire. Berman is killed instantly. Landau and Rosenkrantz, with bullets in them, on the floor, get up, pull out their guns, start firing wildly at the 2 assassins. Mendy Weiss sort of panics, runs out of the restaurant, gets into the getaway car and demands the driver drive away without Workman. Workman's not through yet. Where's the target? Where's the Dutchman? He comes down to the end of the counter, sees the men's room, kicks the door open, sees Dutch Schultz urinating in the urinal. Hasn't even heard the commotion outside the men's room. Workman takes out his .45, shoots twice. The folklore says that the bullets were rubbed in garlic. This is what caused the peritonitis that ultimately killed the Dutchman. The Dutchman By the way, workman then runs out of the restaurant, sees that there's no getaway car, on foot, runs through swamps, runs through open fields, all the way back to Manhattan, is furious, wants to kill Mendy Weiss. Buchholter is called in to ameliorate and moderate the discussion and the furor. It all dies down. The Dutchman staggers out of the men's room, sits down at a table, calmly asks Rosencrantz, who literally has 7 bullets in him, to call for an ambulance. Rosencrantz borrows 10 cents from one of the workers, makes the call, the ambulance comes, and what we have are 2 days of very painful demise of the 3 remaining members of the Dutch Schultz mob. You may know that Dutch Schultz, in his 2 days of agony and dying, launches into a massive stream of consciousness, flow of language that fascinated the police who were monitoring him, and a stenographer wrote it all down. And William S. Burroughs, the famous beat writer, captured all of this into a book called The Last Words of Dutch Schultz. You cannot defy the commission. By the way, this is probably why Jimmy Hoffa was killed, a decision of the commission. And we have the end of the Dutchman and the dissolution or the distribution of his entire empire into the Luciano operation. So what we have here at the end is the end of a tremendous saga in the annals of organized crime. And what I'd like to do next time is talk about Murder Incorporated and the era in the 40s of Buchholter and Shapiro and their Italian counterparts. I want to also get very detailed about organized crime in other cities in America. I want to focus on Boston, organized crime in Boston, and I want to conclude with some degree of understanding of where are we now in terms of organized crime? How is it affecting us as ordinary, normal citizens? Okay, whatever thoughts, comments, questions on your minds, we still have some 10 minutes.
I just want to say I'm from Bayonne, New Jersey,
Yeah.
on the shores of Newark. And in the 60s, when my mother was the legal secretary in Jersey City.
Yeah, I met your mother.
Someone would come around and take their number specs. And,
Oh.
People, and then it was from the Post, right? The winnings at the track was the number. Isn't that what it was or something?
Well,
I mean, it was all very, they just come and say, anybody want to bet?
well, what year was this? What?
I'm talking about the late 60s.
Late 60s. So,
Yeah.
That late.
Oh, yeah.
Gambling, look, I'm not an expert on the division between illicit gambling and legal gambling. But the numbers racket was different from horse racing. The numbers racket was poor people living in Harlem, particularly. That's where Dutch Schultz's domain was located. Poor people who would, it's like now with the lottery. You see people in, convenience stores spending significant amounts of money on lottery tickets. It was the sheer quantity of poor people putting in their nickels and dimes that amounted to $20 million a year. Very lucrative racket. Look, if you read Meyer Lansky, we were business people providing a service to Americans who wanted these services, which the government made illegal.
I love it.
People want booze, they want broads, they want gambling, and they want drugs. And the government has made it essentially illegal. It doesn't make it, so to the criminal mind, that doesn't make sense. We know what people want. We have the capacity to produce the product. We expect a profitable gain in return. And if the government wants to imprison us and incarcerate us, that's the risk we're going to take. Yeah.
Doris, I will say, I had an aunt who had a radio from, I don't know, from very old radio about every horse race in the country. And she would sit with the newspaper and the radio, and she was a bookie. And this was around the same time, the 60s.
Well, there was no off-track betting, Carlos.
Right.
No.
That is how they picked
Yeah,
My grandfather used to do it. There was a winner of, they would pick the lottery, the three numbers were the first three horses that came in a specific way. And then your number was 6, 7, 5. It had, it's just how everyone could know whether they won or not. I remember my grandfather used to do it in the late 60s.
So it was a question of mathematics.
No, it's just a question of how they picked the number. Instead of having like a big thing, a drum or whatever, they just said, all right, there's 12 numbers running at the whatever third race at Hemel Park. That's the numbers that you win.
Uh-huh.
The daily 3 lottery.
Right.
And I remember my grandfather. I know exactly what you're talking about. Because he was a paper dealer. He didn't win any horse queries and money, but he won the thing he would buy at the barbershop. And then they made the mass lottery and he stopped doing it.
Yeah, Mark.
What I find fascinating is the nicknames that they have put out
Yeah,
there.
yeah.
Luciano. And the other question I had for you is, did the police investigate any of these crimes that went on, or?
Well,
Trying to go slide by.
to what extent was there corruption in law enforcement? When you are a gangster with millions of dollars at your disposal, obviously you're going to use some of it to corrupt police, judges, jurors. And that's what happened.
Politicians.
If you didn't terrify people with threats of violence, you bought them off with extravagant bribes. So it took a Dewey, and his successor was William O'Dwyer, both committed to combating organized crime. It took Dewey, who was absolutely incorruptible and brilliant. He became special prosecutor and then governor of New York, and as you know, ran for the presidency of the United States, and he was absolutely surmised to win against Truman. Everybody knows the stunning upset of Truman's victory over Dewey. So that's one of the problems we have with organized crime, because its tentacles reach into respectable people. It takes a very courageous person to come forth and testify against an organized crime criminal.
So, and the same thing, that some of these murders are in the middle of the day, and there's these witnesses, like people who work at the restaurant, and the guards outside the office, or whatever those guys were, and they don't come forward either, apparently. Because everybody says no witnesses in your story.
Look what happened. How many of you remember the murder of a Jewish young 24-year-old law student at NYU? A guy named Arnold Schuster. Anybody remember this name?
When was this?
I was a teenager. Arnold Schuster recognized Willie Sutton, recognized him, and reported Willie Sutton to the police. Willie Sutton, the famous bank robber. Willie Sutton was once asked, "Why do you rob banks?" He says, "That's where the money is." So Arnold Schuster recognizes Willie Sutton, reports him to the police. Willie Sutton is arrested and given a life sentence. Albert Anastasia is watching this on television. Albert Anastasia, called the Lord High Executioner, ruled the commission along with Luciano until Luciano was deported. Anastasia looks at this and says, "I want this guy dead." And Arnold Schuster was murdered. Was there ever a resolution to the murder of Arnold Schuster? Not really, no. I was a teenager. I was in high school when this was happening. So when you get down to it, it was the criminal genius of Rothstein and Lansky. And we'll get to Bugsy Siegel and the Las Vegas Empire and Lansky's development of Hot Springs, Arkansas. I mean, these were masterminds. They saw incredible business opportunities, often utterly illicit. But the problem we have today, I'll get to this if I can next time, is that criminal activity over the years has morphed into licit activity. You have organized crime is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And the division between legitimate businesses owned by the mafia and illegitimate businesses becomes extremely indistinct. The money's everywhere. The possession of enterprises is everywhere. You can't even tell the difference between what's legitimate and what's not. I'm not sure what I left out in this particular saga. What I'll do next time, you can't talk about Jewish gangsters without talking about Murder Incorporated, which was one of the most terrifying episodes in America's social history. And the whole saga of Louis Lepke Buchholder, who was at one time the most notorious gangster in the world, the most hunted human being on the face of the earth. This will be a tale told next time.
I
Yeah.
I grew up in South Jersey, just south of Atlantic City, and we grew up with the stories of the bootleggers bringing guns up on the beach, and you know it was Atlantic City,
Yeah.
Boardwalk. I mean, they had casinos and
Now they were legitimate, weren't they? I mean, the casinos in Atlantic City.
were they legitimate? Yeah. You know the 500?
Yeah, well, yeah. My uncle loved, he still does, he's 92 and he loves to gamble.
Yeah.
And they would go there all the time. I think it was illegal, but there was a back window.
Yeah.
That's funny because the Rat Pack was there often.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I think,
But I think that Jewish gangsters always were kind of a point of pride for the Jewish community. In the same way that the IDF was, that the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was, is that the Jews could be tough, that we weren't just victims.
Yeah.
That we could, that we could, muscle our way in and defend ourselves, and even though they were killers and murderers, as horrible as that was, it was still a point of pride.
Yeah.
And I think that lore sort of kind of passed through to generations. My generation, definitely.
It's an interesting point. There's a very interesting article that I just read that came out in American Scholar. It's about the intergenerational difference in attitude toward the Jewish gangster. Originally, as I suggested last time, it was a terrible shanda for the goyim, that they'd be these notorious Jewish gangsters preying upon often their own people. A further generation growing up before, during, and after the Holocaust, again, looks upon these gangsters as the tough guys, the antithesis to the quavering, crestfallen, terrified victim of anti-Semitism. So even though it was disgraceful that they were committing all these terrible crimes, it was still morally invigorating to see Jews with that kind of tough image. By the way, if you want to read a book absolutely focused on this point, read Rich Cohen's book entitled Tough Jews. I didn't like the book because he simply will not compromise his image of these guys as a kind of heroic posture. in a community that has been utterly traumatized by the Holocaust. But it was a bestseller. So Rich Cohen, Tough Jews, a very good friend of mine with whom I taught at Tel Aviv University, Robert Rockaway, wrote a book whose title came from a discussion he had with his mother. He came from Detroit, and we'll talk about the Purple Gang in Detroit next time. He said, "Ma, didn't we have Uncle Morris? Wasn't he somehow involved with the gangsters?" And oh yeah, Morris and Izzy and Mo and all these. But they were good to their mothers. And that's the title. That's the title of Rockaway's book. Yeah. Now Rockaway, and I'll get to this next time. You can't neglect this aspect of the history, and it comes in two forms. One, the gangster involvement, the Jewish gangster involvement in battling the significant and frightening American Nazi movement.
Yeah.
And you have the sanction by a Jewish judge of Lansky and his cohorts breaking up meetings of the American Bund. Secondly, you have the advent of Zionism and the role of the Jewish gangsters in promoting the interests of the incipient state of Israel. You have the phenomenon of the American government coming to Lucky Luciano, at that time serving a 50 to life year sentence in Sing Sing on organized prostitution, and saying to Luciano, "We need your help in monitoring possible sabotage attempts in the New York dockyards by Nazis." This is during the war. Luciano says, "I will help because we, in effect, control the waterfront, but I want release. I want release from prison."
Brooklyn Navy Yard, right?
Brooklyn Navy Yard, and there was serious threats of American Nazi sabotage. So you have the collusion of the American government with American organized gangsterism. We see it in more recent times with the Kennedy administration reaching out to Sam Giancana to kill Castro. Kennedy was going to use the mafia to eliminate Castro. They tried, but they didn't succeed. So this kind of intermix of legitimacy and illegitimacy proves morally challenging.
They want the same thing. So it's an intellectually defining line as to who's legal and who's not. I like the inversion that you talked about, running a legitimate business. These people, and now the government's taking over some of the things that they had. Say, hey, it's working for them. We should have the money, and our corruption can work. There's two things that I want to say. One to fellow New Jerseyans. I come from the Newark area.
With Zangwill. Yeah.
From Maplewood, right near there. Maplewood and South Orange. Lonnie's woman's
This woman, yeah,
grandson was my classmate.
really.
Another one, Schnitzer was their lawyer. His daughter was my classmate. They lived in South Orange. If you did, mostly South Orange, Jews and Italian mobsters moved to South Orange. Did it happen in southern Jersey as much or not? Because Italians and Jews in the Essex County, Bergen County area,
And Hudson County.
and
Yeah,
where?
Hudson County.
Yes, absolutely,
They,
Hudson
Jersey
County.
City,
We're
Hoboken.
very close, and I gave you the example of a close friend of mine who became a rabbi, married this beautiful Italian woman who is a devout Catholic, and he's still a rabbi. Well, I don't know. I'm turning 80, so maybe he's because he's my age. The other thing that I noticed, though, you talk about the when you're explaining to people, it's the seichel, the Yiddish cup that we really prize. And almost everybody you've mentioned was brilliant.
I did.
Talmud scholars.
But yes,
Yeah.
in it-
They
in
were
it-
the generations beforehand, they would have been.
they would have been Nobel Prize winners probably in some.
Uh,
But we're very proud of that.
Yeah. Meyer Lansky could have been a corporate genius. He could have headed U.S. Steel if he wanted to. He just chose to gravitate his criminal brilliance into illicit activities.
I just want to add one.
Yep.
So, our previous president, Emily Levine, her youngest is Sam Levine,
Uh-huh.
and they're related to Sam Levine.
Red Levine.
Sam Red Levine, because he had red hair, as does our Sam Levine.
Wow.
Jews used to be very known for being redheads. So, there you go.
I have a question. These organizations must have been huge to carry these plans. If you decide to leave, is there any way you can leave the organization?
I don't think so, because there was always the dreaded fear of betrayal. People would kill on orders of the commission for the very possibility of informing or collusion with the authorities. And that's why Joe Valaki was such an astonishing revelation, an astonishing phenomenon. He was the first fully made mafia man to turn total state's evidence. It was Joe Valaki who told the congressional committee about Cosa Nostra. That's the first time anybody had heard the expression, Cosa Nostra, our thing. From the Jewish angle, we'll get to this next time, what utterly damaged Murder Incorporated, what ultimately led to the trial and execution of Louis Buchholzer, who, by the way, was the only mob boss to be executed in the electric chair, the only one. And that was because of the revelations of Abe Reles, R-E-L-E-S, the most feared killer in Murder Incorporated. We'll go into this next time, but that's the fear. And that could get you killed even on the slightest suspicion that you may cooperate with the authorities. So it was like a cult. It was like the membership was through blood. You went through
It
ritual.
was a religious ceremony.
Yeah, it was a religious ceremony.
Of fealty.
And honor. The very word honor and loyalty, tradition, respect, all of this was very appealing, to some young person incorporated into an organized structure.
But not for the Jews. Not for
No.
the Jewish gangsters.
No.
There was a different
Uh,
motivation there.
Yeah, this was, and the other, I just want to point out one last thing. And I'm on tentative ground here, but Italians and Jews in terms of family. And I refer to a passage in David Reisman's famous sociological study of American ethnic relations. And he talks about the difference between the Italian family and the Jewish family. What does he illustrate? A Jewish son or daughter says to his parents, they live in Brooklyn, "Mom, Dad, I really want to go to Stanford." "Oh, Stanford, it's 3,000 miles across the country." "Yeah, but Mom, I have my heart set on Stanford. I think it's going to really fulfill my greatest needs and ambitions." "Sweetheart, whatever you want, whatever is going to be best for you, we're going to support every step of the way." Italian family in Brooklyn, son or daughter says to Mom and Pop, "I really want to go to Stanford." "What? 3,000 miles across? Sweetheart, you're staying right here because that's where your family is." So the family becomes the ultimate end unto itself. In the Italian context, the family is the means toward the fulfillment of the individual offspring, whatever that may be in the Jewish context. Whether this holds up to ultimate sociological scrutiny, I don't know. I'm just referring to David Reisman in his famous book.
Reminds me of a certain Italian friend of mine told me the other day. difference between Jewish mother and Italian mother. The Italian mother says, eat, or I'll kill you. The Jewish mother says, eat, or I'll kill myself.
A crucial distinction. All right, thank you very much. I look forward to it.